Welcome to the third in a series of 3 online events presented by the Da Capo Chamber Players. I'm Bruce Adolph, your guest host for this event. The event combines performances from the ensemble's digital archives with new spontaneous conversations. Our talks are focused on the concept that music can be a bridge to understanding. The world is rich with different kinds of music, different cultures, different vocabularies in the music, different instruments, vocal styles, rhythms, performing traditions. Whether or not music is actually a universal language, it is surely a beloved universal phenomenon that everywhere heightens awareness of our common humanity and deepens compassion. And so music can speak powerfully to human rights. The Da Capo events dedicated to human rights have been and will be on YouTube Live. The first event 1, was called Hearing African American Voices. The second, event 2, was called Asian Echoes. And this is event 3, Paean to Merging Cultures. I'm going to say a word about Da Capo. And if you already know a lot about Da Capo, just think of this as a kind of Da Capo, okay? Da Capo has had about 150 chamber music pieces written for them. They've had concerts in Russia where they introduced audiences there to new American chamber works. They're winners of the 1973 Naumburg Chamber Music Award, and they've been at Bard College Conservatory in residence since 1982 and have given many additional educational residencies across the United States. Da Capo celebrates its 50th anniversary with concerts during the 2021-2022 season, including world premieres by Bruce Adolph, I think I'll go to that one, Shirish Korda, and David Sanford. Here's a quote from the New Yorker. Flaunting its versatility, this esteemed new music group covers an impressive range of idioms and styles. Well, now it's my pleasure to introduce a founding member of Da Capo, flutist Patricia Spencer, who is the series curator. A few words first. Pat is what everyone calls her. Pat gave the New York premiere of the Elliott Carter Flute Concerto, the US premiere of Karl-Heinz Stockhausen's Katinka's Gesang aus Lützeverrechten, staged scene for solo flute and electronics, the Chinese premiere of Gann Ru's Flute Concerto, Fairy Lady Meng Jian, world premiere of Shulamit Ran's Flute Concerto Voices, and Pat had solo CDs on the Neuma label, chamber music CDs with, of course, Da Capo players, and dozens of composers have written flute works for Pat. Many of other composers have written piano works for her, but since she doesn't play the piano, that was a complete waste of their time. Pat teaches flute and chamber music at Bard College Conservatory and at Hofstra University. Now, here's something that I don't want you to think about too much, but I've known Pat I've been working on it since last night, almost 40 years. Either that or more than 40 years, I'm not sure. So to kick this off, I yield my Zoom frame to a founding member of Da Capo, Pat Spencer.
Thank you so much, Bruce. That was really lovely. Thank you. We are totally thrilled, I have to say, that Bruce could join us to host our third musical offering for human rights. We have very happily worked very closely with him for over 35 years, as he says, including a 20th anniversary project and the upcoming premiere for our 50th anniversary. Bruce has also composed many, many works about human rights. A violin concerto titled I Will Not Remain Silent, which has been just released by Milken Archive of Jewish Music Naxos, an upcoming premiere by the Human Rights Orchestra of Europe in Lucerne, a piece titled My Lost One, which will be premiered with soprano Angel Blue. And this coming summer, the Dallas Symphony will premiere a work titled A Kiss to the Whole World in Bravo Vale this summer. So, and there are many, many more that I can't possibly list. Bravo, Bruce, and thank you. Our goal with this series is to let the music pull us toward a greater awareness that every different culture has a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Valerie Coleman's piece, written for Da Capo, in her words, quote, merges the sounds of Native American and African cultures while honoring the legacy of the Freedmen. We hope you enjoy it.
We're back. We just heard a wonderful performance of Valerie Coleman's Freedmen of the Five Civilized Tribes, played by Da Capo chamber players. And to lead a discussion about this, we have with us Whitney Slayton. Let me introduce him to you. Whitney Slayton is Assistant Professor of Music, Ethnomusicology, and American Studies at Bard College. His research is on jazz, music and technology, and experimental ethnography. He contributes to the discourses on ethnomusicology, the philosophy of music, and the sociology of art. Also a saxophonist. Slayton has engaged in collective improvisations in New York City-based world music and jazz scenes. He's performed with percussionist Babatunde Olatunji and the one and only Miriam Makeba. A student of James Williams, Don Braden, Kenny Garrett, and Clark Terry, Whitney Slayton was a member of the Clark Terry Big Band, frequently performing at Birdland, Blue Note, and the Bern International Jazz Festival in Switzerland. He has an extensive discography as a recording producer and recordist, and Slayton previously served as visiting assistant professor at Seton Hall University and the New School. He has a Bachelor of Music degree from William Patterson University, Master of Arts and Masters in Philosophy, and a PhD from Columbia University. Along with Whitney, and joining us for this discussion is Kyle Gunn, who will be introduced in more detail before we hear his piece. Whitney, let's get going on this.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to speak at this event and to mark the significance of Valerie Coleman's work. And to do so, I want to first begin with her own words about the piece. Pat has begun that a bit, and I just wanted to extend the composer's acknowledgement of the history of the freedmen, who were former African slaves adopted into tribal membership through emancipation or marriage, amidst what are called the Five Civilized Tribes. These are inclusive of the specific societies of the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, and Choctaw nations. And it's a fascinating story in which African slaves were at once owned by members of these nations, and as well as the case they had married in to these communities and have lived with them as to this day. And in fact, a number of land rights matters that pertain to these societies extend to the descendants of these enslaved people. And so there's great dynamism associated with the histories that this piece suggests. And much of that we can probably hear pointed to in Coleman's compositional approach. So more on that later. I first want to also just speak some dimensions of a land acknowledgement. It's customary in gatherings like these, even virtually, at least where we are still tied to New York City, to acknowledge that these lands, or virtually the lands we're speaking above or through in a digitized way, are of the Lenni, Lenape, and Wapenters people. And so as we think about, the so-called civilized tribes, or in Kyle's Gann's piece coming up about Hovenweep, we should acknowledge how placed these histories are in proper acknowledgement. But as we move forward, I have some points I'd love for us to discuss, or at least I could just touch on, in ways that also acknowledge ethnomusicology's own indebtedness to the engagements with Native Americans and their cultural legacies. Early ethnomusicology in the United States begins with very fascinating, problematic, interesting approaches to the study of culture itself. And the debates there are between Europe and the United States, all through the discussion of so-called Native American music. And so practices of phonography, engagements of field work and things like this start, as well as, and I'm talking about the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, specific compositional practices that extend into examples like Valerie Coleman's piece today. But to perhaps in the legacy of that, and specifically the legacy of getting these either social scientific or humanistic analytical or creative engagements that seek to find mergers, as Valerie has, I'm brought to the following points. The historical contextualization of the freedmen of the five tribes, civilized tribes. Broadly, African American and Native American encounters, as well as the chance to think about earlier precedents for this sort of work by Valerie Coleman. And for that, I'm drawn to Samuel Coleridge Taylor's work, The Song of Hiawatha. It strikes me that that example from an earlier moment of the 20th century, we often connect to his engagements with Coleridge Taylor's engagements with Pan-Africanism. I wonder what legacy of that continues in this work by Coleman that engages similar sorts of dynamics between African American communities and Native American communities. Coleman's composition also features what we in music studies refer to as the pentatonic scale. This is a 5-pitch scale. It's as if a painter uses a palette of all the colors they use for a composition. Music composers also have something like this in these scales. These are collections of pitches that form melody and harmony, usually, specifically in tonal music, but other sort of musical settings as well. By referring to a pentatonic scale, I'm referring to a 5-pitch scale. Da, 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 and often the octaves repeated, and it ascends and descends. This is something you hear throughout Coleman's composition. It, as well as various features of rhythm, as Coleman writes about in our notes for today, are two musical features, these pentatonic scales and various rhythmic tendencies that we've long spoken about Native American musics and African American musics with. And so the matter of how to listen to them is quite interesting. In many instances, specific formations of rhythm and scale are used in ways to realize cultural specificity. In other ways, they're used for, matters of exoticism that, are steeped in histories of compositional practices of romanticism, let's say, nationalistic romanticism, the late 19th century and its effects throughout the 20th century. And so there's room to explore the mergers about how both of these communities are understood in musical terms by these materials. And it's something fascinating to me because in Coleman's expression, I almost see the shared engagements and assumptions about musical culture through these specific uses of pentatonicism and rhythm. And so hopefully there's a chance for us to discuss this and think about ways to listen for this. But the last point I'll say about it is that oftentimes we who are trained in music, musicians, composers, use those terms, the pentatonic scale or rhythm or syncopation and so forth. And, we may not be aligning with the terminologies used by these original members of societies, associated with these musics, but they're important beginning points to consider how we begin conversations about learning about different musical cultures. So I want us to consider this. And then finally, I'm also interested in the significance of the freedmen of the Five Civilized Tribes within the contemporary moment. I invite ways for us to identify what the history of freedmen means for contemporary understandings of Black life in the United States. In addition, I want us to further discuss how Coleman's composition encourages participants of concert life to honor the legacy of the freedmen and these Native American populations. And so with that, I open us up for a discussion of any of these points or others, whether it be about our, considerations of melody, or these rhythmic dimensions we're drawn to.
Kurt, it looks like you might have something to say. Kurt, of course, is the violinist of the Capo chamber choir.
I am. I just wanted to pick up on the pentatonic scale and the use of a rather limited set of motives throughout the piece, from which she really creates a very haunting, poignant, expressive composition. There's the da, ba, ya, da, 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 which passes around in various keys, various instruments throughout the piece. And then I was struck also about 5 minutes in, she gives the pianist and me, the violinist, something that sounds very bluesy, very free and improvised. And that struck me as a wonderful addition, motivic addition to the piece.
That's fascinating. I just wanted to respond to that. I'm hearing that too, and I think that's what had brought me to consider the pentatonic scale, because historically, these many different nations that we, refer to under the umbrella term Native American or American Indian, for instance, are known to use what we, again, call the pentatonic scale. And it's also the case that African Americans use this very similar scale. In fact, maybe just an inversion where, the one pitch that ends in the major version of the pentatonic scale moves to the bass to form what we call a minor pentatonic scale. The blues scale, so the specific musical feature Kurt's referring to is merely just a pentatonic scale with the addition of a blues pitch, a pitch that's between the fourth and fifth interval. Da, 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 da. And so the pentatonicism associated with both musical worlds in Coleman's composition, Freedmen of the Five Civilized Tribes, allows her to very creatively slip between cultural associations. And I think we're on solid ground to consider more about the merger, that comes from Coleman's expression here, because I agree with you, Kurt. I think that's a very fascinating slippage that we see here in this.
No, if I can jump in, I just want to say one thing about the pentatonic scale that I'm sure everyone here knows, but since there are people listening who might not, aside from African American and Native American usage, it's, it is one of those scales that seems to be in every folk culture, maybe not every, obviously, but many folk cultures, including Appalachia, where it comes from Celtic music. It's very powerful in Celtic music and in Chinese music. And then there are pentatonic scales that have half steps in Japanese music and Korean music, and because of this phenomenon of the pentatonic scale, especially certain forms being worldwide and global, people have, and when I say people, I mean musicologists who are sort of people who have researched this around the world to try to see how could this be, and which came first, traveling? Is it people traveling around the world, or is it that the music is innately, is there something innate in human beings that works with the pentatonic scale? Bobby McFerrin has looked into this, and for anyone watching who is at all curious about the pentatonic scale, if you Google the pentatonic scale and Bobby McFerrin, you'll have a great time with the pentatonic scale, because he has done this performance where he gets the whole audience to, whether they've ever heard it before or not, to predict which note comes next in a series of movements by both dancing and singing. And it is a great lesson in the pentatonic scale. Bobby McFerrin, I believe, seems to think that it's kind of built into humanity. And then the other argument with neuroscientists is, even if it is, when did that happen and why? So I'll leave it at that. Pat, you look like you want to say something.
Well, I was actually, that's just absolutely fascinating. And I was actually going to shift to asking about the rhythms a little bit, because in her program notes, Valerie Coleman mentions that the piece is sometimes languid and other times charged with strong traditional African native rhythms. And I'm not very informed about native rhythms, so this conversation is fascinating to me. Noticing that the opening sections of her piece certainly go back and forth between exactly that, the languid, and then these sudden, quick outbursts, very rhythmic. I'm wondering if one of you can tell me if those outbursts are typical Native American outbursts. Ba-dum, 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 ba-dum.
You mean African American?
Yeah. I mean, Native, well, if those artists are, if they're typical Native American or African American.
Okay.
Well, I'll just jump in to say that everything from, the discourse of Bobby McFerrin to neurology and things like this, as well as this earlier history and ethnology I referred to, really sought to sort of place cultural features as something ingrained, something neurological and things like this. The consensus of the social sciences and the humanities has moved forward in ways to relocate these sort of origins or operations of culture to acknowledge the extent to which there's movement. Human history is quite varied and often involves actual, flows and engagements from society to society. But the pentatonic scale truly in this way is one of the most controversial musical examples to think about. And so that also extends to, Pat's examples of rhythm. Can we say that specific, this sort of moment in the music is emblematic of a continental musical tendency or a societal one? It could be, but it's also the case that there's room to explore specificity, for this particular people in this place of this time. What we call rhythm may be a temporality of history. It may be something about the life cycle. It could mean something philosophical, theological. And to me, that's what's exciting about ethnomusicology, is that we can start with very impassioned, very creative ways of expressing and listening. And that begins a very important foundation for how we learn specifically about how the people think about their expressions.
Whitney, thank you so much. I think we need to move on at this point. And I'm going to ask Kurt to introduce Kyle Gunn.
It's my pleasure to introduce Kyle Gunn. I was first aware of him in the 80s because I was reading a publication which unfortunately is no longer the Village Voice, and he was the music critic for almost 20 years for that paper. And I learned a great deal about music in general and American music specifically from reading his reviews. He is a composer and author of 7 books on American music, including books on microtonality, Charles Ives' Concord Sonata, John Cage's 4 minutes, 23 seconds, Conlon Nancarrow, and Robert Ashley. He studied composition with Ben Johnston, Morton Feldman, and Peter Gaina. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And about a fourth of his music is microtonal. His major works include Concerto, Sunken City, Transcendental Sonnets for chorus and orchestra, the microtonal music theater piece Custer and the Sitting Bull, The Planets for mixed octet, and Hyperchromatica for 3 retuned computer-driven pianos. More recently, my association with Kyle has been more personal. Da Capo has been in residence at Bard College for many years, and Kyle has been a professor of music there for, I think, something like 14 years. So
No,
it is,
24.
excuse me, sorry about that. And it's been wonderful working with him and with his students over the years.
Thank you. It's wonderful being included. It's interesting, the question of rhythm, because a lot of my musical style is based on Native American rhythms, but it's a really specific tradition. The Coleman piece has to do with a lot of the Eastern tribes, the Choctaw, the Cherokee, Seminole, right? And a lot of my music has dealt specifically with rhythms of the Western tribes, particularly the Hopi, Zuni, and the Pueblo tribes, like the Laguna sound, Ildefonso, like that. What I first I should say Hovenweep, I wrote in 2000. Joan Tower asked me to write it for the St. Luke Chamber Players, and she said she wanted something with a specifically American theme. And I didn't think I could get any more American than Hovenweep. Hovenweep is an incredible ruin, kind of an apartment complex made of rocks on what is now the Utah-Colorado border. And it was continuously, well, the area was continuously occupied from 8000 BC to 1300. And the buildings that are there now were built between 900 and 1300. And by 1300, they had, due to climate change problems, things like that, somehow they disappeared. So these people were Americans on the American continent before Amerigo Vespucci was born. So before Columbus arrived here. But the music of that part of the Native American world, the Hopi, Zuni, and the Pueblo Indians were tribes that had come up from the South. And as opposed to the Navajo and Apache and some of the other tribes that had come down from the North. And I was really interested in having different tempos at the same time from my studies of Charles Ives as early as junior high. And there was a book by Patsy Escott and Robert Cogan called Sonic Design, which analyzed a Zuni buffalo dance. And what some of those tribes do in their dances is they shift back and forth among different tempos. That could be a dun, 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 dun. And for me, it solved a rhythmic problem. And so I transferred that kind of rhythm to notation so I could use it for ensemble purposes. And so lots of my ensemble music, including Hovenweep, is based on that kind of shifting rhythm. And from going to dances and powwows, I found out that at least in some cases that rhythm has to do with dance, in that if you're making a leg motion, it takes a different amount of time than an arm motion. And so when the dance shifts, they go into a different tempo and then they go back.
All right, this is a fine introduction to hearing your piece, Hovenweep. And here we're going to hear, of course, the Da Capo Chamber Players. That was a performance by the Da Capo chamber players of Hovenweep by Gunn. And I'd like to ask a question, Kyle. I happen to know a guy named Jonathan Farwell. He's an actor now in his late 80s. And I know this sounds unbelievable, but he is the son of Arthur Farwell, who was a leader in the Indianist movement, they call it.
Wow, sure.
Part of the 20th, I know he's still alive. Early part of the 20th century, when one way to put it with current lingo is that white classically trained male composers, I don't normally talk like this, but that, white classically trained male composers made use of Indian or Native American melodies and rhythms. And who spurred them on? Who told them to do this? Dvorak, Antonin Dvorak, who also was at that point a friend of Harry T. Burleigh. So it all sort of comes together. I'm just curious, knowing that history, as I'm sure you do, how do you see or how do you position what you're doing now with that long ago kind of movement of the Indianists in the United States?
Well, those people fascinate me, and one of those people actually was Fruccio Bussoni, the great Italian composer who came and worked in. He wrote three pieces based on American Indian melodies. Farwell was an amazing guy. He spent a lot of time out west in the very early 20th century, going to powwows, listening to that music. And today his piano pieces based on them seem kind of over romanticized, and like I cannot sell them. I can't sell my students on them. But at the time, they were really forward-looking attempts to not only set American music melodies, but also to draw the harmony from the melodic materials themselves.
To me, I want to make a little comparison, because I hear those exact piano pieces you're talking about by Farwell as a kind of parallel to Harry T. Burleigh's spiritual settings, because both of them at that time were writing in a harmonic world that relates to Dvorak, which was so permeated. It just permeated American thinking, and it's very beautiful. And it's pre-Hollywood, and then Hollywood sort of picked up on some of this and kind of messed it up for everything.
Mm-hmm. But for me, at the time when minimalism first appeared, and when it went public in 1974, Steve Reich, who had studied Ghanaian drumming, and Phil Glass had worked with Ravi Shankar. Minimalism was all about bringing in these other world musics into music. And for me, I thought the chance to bring in a Native American melodic aesthetic was a new contribution. Now, I realize that, in more recent years, there's been a lot of thought about this as being appropriation of music. And I did work, I did have some contact with Native American musicians at powwows and everything, but for me, it was important to kind of abstract from that language and relate it to notated music, and bring my creator rhythmic style that was inspired by it, but actually a different kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. So, Pat, did you have a thought or a question at this point?
Well, I do, but I think my question is going to follow Kurt's. So
Okay.
I think that Kurt.
Let's bring to Kurt.
Okay, Kyle, I was just wondering if you could elaborate on that. This reminds me, I wonder if this is akin to Bartok and Kodaly going out into the people and hearing their motives and music. Was that part of your research, or how did you go about finding this music?
Oh, to say that would glorify it. I did actually meet a leader of a Zuni group in Chicago called the Chi-Town Singers. And I would go to their rehearsals and ask him questions about it, but it was very difficult to translate the musical technical terms. I have a very large collection of recordings of American Indian music going back to the 1920s. And it is, Francis Densmore was out there in 1920 making recordings of that music. And so I did lots of transcription. I went to powwows near Albuquerque and Taos, and would transcribe the music while they were singing it, things like that. But not a whole lot of direct contact.
Kurt, I have to point out that the comparison with Bartok and Kodaly doesn't work, because they were recording their own people.
Mm.
They
Right.
were recording the folk people of their own heritage. So it's more like, actually, oddly enough, Messiaen taking Hindu rhythms from India.
Mhm.
He didn't go there and study them. He read them in an encyclopedia, and that's all he did, which was kind of interesting.
If I'd been studying the music of my own people, it would have been Waylon Jennings. So
Okay. So Pat, what
Okay, my question is, Kyle, you have visited Hovenweep. I wonder if there are some photos that we could view of this remaining structures that they built.
sure, the National Park Service keeps a very good website on it, and it's got lots of amazing pictures.
Well, thank you. Those are really amazing. And it makes me realize that one thing they must have done a lot of is stone cutting. They must have chiseled. And it occurs to me that the rhythms of their life were partly perhaps governed by this incredible building that they did. Do you think that's possible?
Well, everybody who lived at Hovenweep has been dead for 800 years, so we're not. There's no basis for assuming that their musical style was like the Hopi and Zuni many centuries later. But the Hopi were the only tribe that never suffered military defeat at the hands of the American army. They live on three mesas. It was very easy to go around these three mesas. The Americans had no reason to defeat them. And so that's been a very continuous culture. And I know they keep up their language and farming habits and things like that.
But so their music must also then be ancient.
Presumably. And there are family resemblances between those tribes in the southern Arizona area.
For the piece, you mentioned multiple tempos, and I'm really drawn to that. Did you figure out, what decides when one encounters another level of tempo? I mean, what sort of features determine when you shift?
They're composed songs, and so when you get to a certain place in the song, you shift to the other tempo for a while. And I don't know whether the song followed the dance or the dance followed the song.
Mm-hmm.
But there are, I have found transcriptions of those songs in books, and I've done a lot of transcription myself, and they'll sing they'll do several verses of the same song, and it'll be the same rhythmic pattern each time. Especially, and also the Hopi are using a scale that is not our tempered scale, and they will hit some notes that sound out of tune, but they're out of tune every time they hit them. Mm-hmm. So they obviously have some sense of scale in their head.
Well, that's a great comment, because it's very important when we talk about the idea of merging. Like you said, it's not always about that. It's influence. It's like, let's say I mentioned Messiaen. There's a global palette. There's a lot going on in the world, and there are ways to do it right and ways to do it wrong. And people are very tense these days about looking at or appropriating something. I mean, for example, taking a religious idea and using it in a way that is trivial or frivolous without realizing that they're doing it. So what's important really is the sense of not only give and take, but a real study and understanding and respect for what you're doing, and going into a new area by, I'm not sure if the word is merge, but a sense of collaboration and influence that goes back and forth. And we're entering a really great global era, I have to say. It's been getting like that more and more since maybe the beginning of the 20th century. And let's hope that it continues to be a way of uniting people. The composer Sofia Gubaidulina remarked in an interview, quote, "Why do I have so much pain in my soul? Because I see that humanity is gripped by hatred, this virus, and it's very difficult to escape from it. I care about universal human values, not Eastern or Western values, unquote. The actual merging of musical cultures has had a renaissance in our time, to a great extent because of Yo-Yo Ma's Silk Road project and its global musicians workshop, where musicians from all over the world get together and they improvise and compose together in a kind of cultural crucible. And of course, the Silk Road was inspired by earlier collaborations of Yohani Menuhin and Ravi Shankar. And the European organization Musicians for Human Rights now brings together musicians from all over the world to give performances to raise money for marginalized and suffering communities throughout the world. But the idea of merging cultures actually has a pretty complex history. To be a true merger, like we were saying earlier, there should be some collaboration, as with Menuhin and Shankar. And throughout most of the history, we have seen rather influences drawn from what is perceived to be as exotica as a means of personal renewal for a particular artist's style. So for example, Picasso's use of African arts and Messiaen's use of Indian rhythms were not mergers, but they were certainly remarkable. Debussy was influenced by Japanese music. Bizet found Spanish music exotic. Ravel used the blues to write something that didn't sound like the blues, but it was wonderful. George Crum went to China. And if he had not been in China, he would not have been able to discover the kind of personal voice that he did, which is heavily influenced by Chinese music. But if we think more specifically just about the broader topic of music and human rights, it's a longer history than people might think. For me, probably the most powerful piece of music that speaks truth to power is by Beethoven. It's the second movement of the fourth piano concerto, the slow movement. In this movement, the orchestra, which at this point is just strings, makes this unison, forceful, imperious kind of accusation. And then a solitary figure, this is a solo piano, responds very softly with simplicity and clarity. And then the orchestra's fierceness is gradually tamed by an increasingly eloquent appeal to human decency and a passionate plea for mercy that comes directly from the keyboard. Then I can mention Janacek, 1905. That's the name of his piece, a piece about a prisoner killed by the police in front of a university. It's music that is very clearly about violence, grief, and outrage. I also want to mention UNESCO in 2011 declared April 30th to be International Jazz Day. And they said that because they were affirming the belief that jazz music is intrinsically about freedom and human rights. But how does music speak of these things when music is naturally multivalent? Just before the pandemic, I wrote a piece for the Dallas Symphony. And the work is called A Kiss to the Whole World, which is from Schiller, and it's from Beethoven's Night, Diesen Kuss der ganzen Welt. I chose this quote to be the title and the message. In other words, that humankind is all together in this world, that we're all related, and we should celebrate humanity with love and joy. I mention this because I'll tell you about the arc of the piece. The piece begins with intensely lyrical, sweet music, but when you don't expect it, there's this kind of hushed, threatening, violent music. And this menacing music gets louder and louder, takes over the whole orchestra. And then the entire orchestra is playing this violent music. It gradually subsides, and the more delicate, sweeter music reemerges. But right at the end, that menacing music makes a brief appearance, but it's not so threatening anymore, and it disappears. Now, when I wrote the piece, I was thinking about hatred and racism infecting humanity. That's what it was supposed to be about. But the piece is going to get its premiere this summer. And I think it's not going to be understood that way. I think people will hear it as being about the global pandemic, because it's exactly the same structure of humanity being infected by a virus. And that brings me back to my quote at the beginning of Gubai Delina, who called hatred a virus. This is all to say that music means many things, you know. Wordless music provides a compelling channel for a universally comprehensible expression of being human. The experience of music is not a diversion all the time. It's not just a distraction. It's not just an entertainment. It's a path. And it's a path to what is extraordinary in being human. And you can find there the resonance of despair and hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. That's just a wonderful, wonderful description of some of the deeper, richer possibilities of our goals with this series. It's really appreciate hearing that. Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
So I'm next. I need to thank some important people, and I want to start by saying it's wonderful. We enjoy bragging about what we've done. We have these 150 pieces. We took music to Russia. We won the Naumburg and so forth. But we would be nothing without our funders, and their support for artistic activities changes the world. So a huge thank you to all of them. They're listed in the PDF of the program. Please thank them in your hearts. We appreciate them tremendously. In particular, we are dedicating this series to Bernard Hulbert, MD. The Hulbert Charitable Trust has given us support for more than 2 decades and has made a significant difference in the scope of what we can offer. We're honored to extend this dedication. Also, the unseen movers and shakers behind artistic projects are the organizers. Amy Roberts-Frawley, producer, Andres Leon, technical director, Leah DiStefano, graphic designer, Josephine Hemsing Associates, public relations, and Sarah Elia, social media, have all put in unbelievable imagination and problem solving and a zillion extra hours. And we have to say thank you.
Next season is a biggie for us. It's our 50th anniversary. Over my years with Da Capo, one thing I've been particularly proud of has been our association not only with famous composers of the 20th century, 21st century, living, well-known composers, but also younger, yet to be established composers, people we have met at our residencies, for instance, at Bard College and other places. We found some gems in these associations, and we've incorporated them into our repertoire. Well, this 50th anniversary series next year, 3 concerts, is going to reflect that broad range of interest. Each concert will include a world premiere, the first one by Bruce Adolphe, of all people, the second by Shirish Corday, and the third, David Sanford, who you may remember was one of the speakers on our first musical offerings program recently. Each program is entitled Bridging in some aspect. The first one is Bridging Eras, Then and Now. So the piece of Adolph's that I mentioned, George Pearl, Joan Tower, and some younger composers. The second one, Bridging Cultures. Shirish Corday will premiere, Shulamit Ran, Tanya Leon, George Walker, Eric Moe, Stephen Albert. And then lastly, Bridging Styles. David Sanford will premiere, Jason Eckhart, Judith Shaitan, Elliot Carter, and Steve Wright. So as I was saying, this broad range and diversity of programming, which again, I've been thrilled to be part of for my years in Da Capo, is reflected in next year's 50th anniversary. And we hope to see you in person at those concerts.
And thank you so much also for joining us for this musical offerings series. And we're glad you could be here, and we hope you can come to the concert.
Thank you.